There is a 40-second scene buried inside a 1993 episode of The Simpsons where a factory worker in Japan coughs into a cardboard box. The box gets shipped to America. An entire town gets sick. A mob forms. A crate of killer bees gets released by accident. The whole thing is played for laughs. 27 years later, the world shut down. That is the one everyone knows. But it is not the strangest one. It is not the most specific one. It is not even close to the most accurate one, because across 35 years and over 800 episodes, the writers of The Simpsons have stumbled into the future so many times and in so many different ways that the question stopped being whether it happened and started being how. 10 cases, a pandemic, a presidency, a government surveillance program, a tiger attack, a corporate merger worth $52 billion, a sports result 8 years early, all of it real, all of it documented. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's get into it. The Osaka flu and COVID-19. There is a moment in a 1993 episode of The Simpsons where a factory worker in Japan coughs into a box. Not dramatically, not with any music swelling underneath it. He just coughs. The germs float into the cardboard and the lid goes on. The box gets shipped to America. 6 to 8 weeks later, everyone in Springfield is sick. 27 years after that episode aired, the world shut down. Before getting into what the show actually did and did not predict, it helps to know exactly what was happening in 1993 when this episode was made. The writers had been given a simple assignment: get Marge arrested. That was the whole pitch. She needed to end up in jail for a month. The how was left to the episode's writers, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. They needed a reason for Marge to be so exhausted, so stretched thin, that she would accidentally walk out of a store without paying for something. Their answer was a flu. A silly cartoon flu that traveled from Japan to America inside a blender delivery box. They called it the Osaka flu. That is the entire origin of this so-called prediction. Not a warning, not a vision. A logistical solution to a character problem inside a 22-minute animated comedy. The episode is called Marge in Chains. It is Season 4, Episode 21. It aired on May 6, 1993 on Fox. In the opening minutes, a television commercial for a product called the Juice Loosener convinces nearly every adult in Springfield to order one. The juicers are packed and shipped from a factory in Osaka, Japan. One of the workers there has the flu. The show makes this funny. The little cloud of germs floats around comically, waits at a red light, and then ducks under another cloud of germs cruising through a green light. It is cartoonish on purpose. The germs behave like cartoon characters. When the boxes arrive in Springfield and get opened, everyone who touches them gets sick. Homer gets sick. Bart gets sick. Lisa gets sick. Grandpa gets sick. The whole town gets sick. Marge does not get sick. Marge never gets sick. She is too busy taking care of 4 ill family members to catch anything herself. She runs on no sleep, no rest, nothing. And one day at the Quickie Mart, while grabbing Grandpa's bourbon, she forgets to pay. The store's alarm goes off. She gets arrested. That is the episode. That is what Marge in Chains is actually about. It is about a woman being crushed by the weight of taking care of everyone around her. About a community that relies entirely on one person, and about what happens when that person finally buckles. The Osaka flu is scaffolding. It exists to make Marge tired. But here is what happened when 2020 arrived. COVID-19 began spreading in late 2019 and early 2020. It originated in Asia. It spread via international travel and close contact. Governments around the world shut their borders. Hospitals filled up. People panicked. Grocery stores ran out of supplies, and within weeks, screenshots from Marge in Chains were everywhere online. Side-by-side comparisons, the sick factory worker, the floating germs, the overwhelmed town. The text replaced in some images to read not Osaka flu, but coronavirus. Bill Oakley, the man who wrote the episode, found out people were using his work this way, and he was not happy about it. Not a little unhappy, actually upset. He told The Hollywood Reporter directly, "The idea that anyone was using the episode to make COVID seem like an Asian plot was, in his words, terrible and gross." He was clear that his reference for the Osaka plot device was the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which he had read about as a child. He said it was just supposed to be a quick joke about how the flu got here. He also pointed out the obvious. The show made the flu cartoonishly unrealistic on purpose. The germs were visible. They waited at traffic lights. A virus surviving 6 to 8 weeks inside a cardboard box is not how viruses work. None of it was meant to be taken seriously. Oakley also said something broader that matters for understanding this entire essay. When asked about the general idea that The Simpsons predicts the future, he said, "There are very few cases where the show actually predicted something. It is mainly just coincidence because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. Most of the episodes are based on things that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that the writers already knew about." Snopes, the fact-checking organization, went through the circulating images in detail. Their conclusion was straightforward. The first 3 panels in the most viral version of this comparison were real and did come from margin chains. But the 4th panel, the one showing news anchor Kent Brockman with the words coronavirus on screen, was fake. Someone had taken a screenshot from a completely different episode, Season 22's The Fool Monty, and added the words on top. The original image had read Apocalypse Meow. The version being shared as a Simpsons prediction had been digitally altered. So what is the honest version of this section? Here it is. In 1993, The Simpsons wrote an episode about a flu that started in Asia, spread to America through a commercial product, and made an entire town sick while one exhausted woman held everything together. In 2020, a virus that began in Asia spread globally and made an entire world sick while healthcare workers and caregivers held everything together. Those two things rhyme. They do not match. The Osaka flu traveled inside a box. COVID-19 did not spread through packages. The Osaka flu was visible to the naked eye and obeyed traffic signals. COVID-19 was not and did not. The factory in the show was in Japan. The origins of COVID-19 were in China. What the show actually captured, without meaning to, was something more basic than a specific virus. It captured the shape of how contagion spreads through a connected, global, consumer-driven society. Products move, workers touch them. Germs move with the products. A supply chain becomes a disease route. That structural idea, the idea that the world's economy and the world's epidemics are the same network, is what made the comparison feel true, even when the specific details were wrong. The writers also got the human response right. In the episode, Springfield residents panic and gather outside the hospital demanding a cure. They knock over a truck they believe contains medicine. The truck breaks open. What was actually inside it was a crate labeled "Killer Bees." The swarm escapes and attacks the crowd. This was a joke in 1993. It was a very specific kind of joke. The one where the panicked crowd makes everything worse than the original problem. In spring 2020, scientists confirmed the presence of Asian giant hornets, quickly nicknamed murder hornets, in Washington state. The connection to the Simpsons episode started circulating again. CNN covered it. ABC News covered it. Bill Oakley, who had at first pushed back against all of this, had by then come to accept it, at least publicly, while still maintaining that coincidence was the real explanation. The most important thing about this section is not whether The Simpsons predicted COVID-19. It did not in any meaningful sense. Bill Oakley said so. The details do not match. The intent was never there. What actually happened is something more interesting. A show that had watched the world carefully for 4 seasons, that had paid attention to how consumer products move and how diseases travel and how communities panic, accidentally built a story whose bones matched the bones of a real catastrophe that came 27 years later. The show was not clairvoyant, it was observant. And observation, when it is sharp enough and specific enough, has a way of outlasting the moment it was made in. There is also a quieter version of this story that almost nobody talks about. Marge in Chains is remembered now, because of the 2020 comparisons, as a prediction episode. That reading buries what the episode is actually about. It is about a woman who takes care of 4 sick people without getting sick herself, without complaining, without stopping, and who then gets arrested for the one moment of human failure she has in the entire episode. The town turns on her, the same town she was nursing back to health. The flu is the backdrop. The real subject is invisible labor and what happens when the person doing all of it finally drops something. That is the episode Bill Oakley wrote. That is what got lost when screenshots of floating cartoon germs started showing up next to COVID-19 headlines in 2020. The writers of The Simpsons have always been careful about one thing. They write about systems, how towns work, how economies work, how institutions fail, how one bad decision inside a factory can ripple outward until a whole community is sick in bed. The Osaka flu is funny because it is absurd, but absurdity in The Simpsons has always had a skeleton underneath it made of something real. The episode ends with Springfield on the mend. Marge gets out of jail, the flu passes, life returns to normal. It is tidy, the way sitcoms are tidy. The real COVID-19 pandemic ended with more than 6 million confirmed deaths globally, and a world that is still not sure what normal means anymore. The Simpsons did not predict that. Nobody could have predicted that, but they built something small and funny in 1993 that rhymed with something enormous and devastating in 2020. And that rhyme, imperfect and unintentional, is what made the comparison land. Not because the writers saw the future, because they understood, even then, how fragile the line is between the world working and the world not working. Underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore. That fragility is worth keeping in mind because the next case, the one from the year 2000, involves a man the writers put in the Oval Office as a joke about America going insane. And what happened 16 years later made Bill Oakley's story about the Osaka flu look like a warm-up. Section 2. Donald Trump's Presidency. On March 19, 2000, a middling episode of The Simpsons aired on Fox. Critics at the time were not impressed. Entertainment Weekly would later call it one of the worst episodes the show had ever produced. It ranked 28th in the ratings for its week. It was watched in about 8.77 million households, which, for a show that had pulled over 30 million viewers in its prime years, was not a number anyone was celebrating. The episode was called Bart to the Future. It was season 11, episode 17. Almost nobody remembers anything about it except for one line. That line is 11 words long. Lisa Simpson, sitting in the Oval Office of the White House, surrounded by advisors, says, "As you know, we have inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump." That is it. That is the whole prediction. 11 words. A throwaway line in an episode people considered forgettable. A line that in the year 2000 read as a joke so absurd it barely needed a punchline. Donald Trump as President of the United States was so far outside the edges of what seemed possible that the writers used it the same way they might use a punchline about aliens landing in Springfield. It was not a serious political statement. It was, by the writer's own admission, a symbol of everything going wrong all at once. 16 years later, on November 8, 2016, Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States. 4 days after that, the season 28 episode of The Simpsons opened with Bart at the chalkboard writing the same sentence over and over, which is how the show has always opened. The sentence he was writing was, "Being right sucks." To understand why this matters as more than a lucky coincidence, it helps to understand exactly what the episode was doing and why the writers chose Trump specifically. Bart to the Future is a flash-forward episode. Bart, visiting an Indian casino with his family, meets a casino manager who shows him a vision of his adult life 30 years in the future, set in the year 2030. In the vision, Bart is a middle-aged failure. He lives in a beach cabin with Ralph Wiggum. He plays gigs at a seafood restaurant where he gets paid in popcorn shrimp instead of money. He has dropped out of school. He has no savings, no plan, nothing going for him. His sister Lisa, however, has become the President of the United States. Specifically, she is described as America's first straight female president, which is its own kind of joke. But the relevant detail is what Lisa walks into when she takes office. Her advisor, a balding adult version of Milhouse Van Houten, lays out the situation. The country is broke, completely broke. Not in a small way. The United States has sold off its natural landmarks to pay its debts. It has borrowed money from every country it can find. It is dependent on foreign aid. The reason for all of this is the presidency that just ended, the Trump presidency. Milhouse explains that Trump's initiative of investing in the nation's children backfired completely. The result was a generation of extremely strong supercriminals, because well-fed and well-rested children apparently grew up into very effective lawbreakers. The country is bankrupt. The streets are dangerous. Lisa has inherited a disaster. The writer who built all of this was Dan Greaney. He was interviewed by The Hollywood Reporter in March 2016, several months before the election, when Trump's candidacy had made the episode suddenly relevant again. Greaney was direct about what he was going for. He said the episode was a warning to America. He said that a Trump presidency just seemed like the logical last stop before hitting bottom. He said it was pitched because it was consistent with the vision of America going insane. He also said something that is easy to miss. He thought of Trump at that time, the year 2000, as kind of lovable in a blowhard way. Trump was a tabloid figure, a big personality, someone who fit naturally into the over-the-top world of Springfield. That framing matters. The Simpsons did not put Trump in the episode because they thought he was genuinely dangerous. They put him there because he was already, in the year 2000, a symbol of a certain kind of American excess. Big buildings with his name on them, loud opinions, business deals that fell apart spectacularly. He had run for president briefly in 1999 and 2000 as part of the Reform Party before dropping out. The episode was written during that campaign. Trump was already on the writer's radar as a political figure, just not a serious one. That is the honest context for the prediction. The writers were not looking into the future. They were looking at the present. In the year 2000, Donald Trump was a man who had declared bankruptcy multiple times, who had run for president as a joke candidate, and who was famous mostly for putting his name on things in very large gold letters. Making him the disastrous predecessor to a more serious leader was not a vision. It was a joke that made sense given what was already known about him. The prediction is real. The magic is not. What makes this case different from most of the others in this essay is that the writer himself was willing to talk about it. Greaney did not brush off the comparison. He engaged with it, and what he said is more interesting than just, "Yes, we predicted it." He said the episode was a warning. He used that word specifically, a warning, which means the writers, in some way, were taking seriously the possibility that American politics could arrive at a place where someone like Trump was not just a candidate, but a winner. They treated it as a worst-case scenario. They dressed it up in comedy because that is what The Simpsons does. But the bones of the joke were genuinely dark. The episode also did something quietly remarkable that most people who talk about the Trump prediction miss entirely. It did not just put Trump in the White House. It described what he left behind. Not just a broken economy, a broken country. Natural landmarks sold off. Foreign aid needed. A generation of super criminals. The joke is specific about the kind of damage it imagines. That specificity is not the same as prophecy, but it is the sign of writers who were thinking past the punchline. There is another layer to this story that arrived in 2021, when Vice President Kamala Harris was sworn into office on January 20th, 2021. Photographs of her on the inauguration platform spread everywhere. She was wearing a purple pantsuit and white pearls. Within hours, someone noticed that Lisa Simpson, in her vision of the future presidency in Bart to the Future, was also wearing a purple pantsuit and white pearls. The resemblance was striking. Multiple news outlets covered it. The Simpsons writer Mike Scully was asked about it. His explanation was simple and honest. He said the pantsuit might have been a nod to Hillary Clinton, or the writers were just going for a power look. The color purple, he said, seemed to have been a random choice made by the animators. And the pearls were no mystery at all. Lisa always wears pearls. They are part of her design. They have been since the show began. So the Harris comparison is, by the writer's own account, almost entirely coincidental. But the broader Trump comparison, the one that started 16 years earlier, is something Greene himself has stood behind. He wrote it as a warning. It came true. And the show acknowledged it on a chalkboard 4 days after the 2016 election. Al Jean, who has been the showrunner of The Simpsons since 2001, and who was one of the show's original writers going back to season 1, has talked about predictions more generally. He told the New York Times in 2018 that the writers are always thinking roughly 1 year ahead because of how long it takes to produce an episode. He also explained that many of what look like predictions are really just educated guesses. He compared the show's writers to Stanley Kubrick, who put video calls and tablet computers in his 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey, because he had futurologists helping him figure out what the world might look like 30 years later. The Simpsons writers had something similar, just less formal. A room full of very smart people who read constantly and argued about where things were headed. Gene also noted something specific about the Trump prediction. He pointed out that the year originally set in the Bart to the Future episode was 2030. Trump would be 84 years old in 2030. Gene noted on Twitter after the 2024 election that after Trump's second non-consecutive term, 2030 would actually line up as a plausible year for a successor to be cleaning up whatever came before. The show itself responded to 2016 more directly than just the chalkboard gag. A 2015 YouTube short called Trumptastic Voyage, made during the early days of Trump's campaign, featured Homer shrinking down and traveling inside Trump's hair. It was a parody. It was also, in hindsight, made by a room of writers who had been sitting with the possibility of a Trump presidency since the year 2000 and were watching it begin to actually happen. There is one more thing worth saying about this section, and it is the thing that gets lost in all the coverage of the prediction itself. Bart to the Future is a bad episode. Critics said so at the time. The fans who have reviewed it since largely agree. The plot involving Bart's adult failure is thin. The future Springfield is not particularly well developed. The jokes do not land the way Golden Era Simpsons jokes land. It is a season 11 episode, which means it came after the moment many fans consider the show's peak, and yet it contains one of the most discussed lines in the history of the series. A line that was, in the year 2000, so unserious that it barely registered. A line that a generation of writers put into a mediocre episode as a joke about America going insane. A line that by 2016 had become the single thing most people remembered about the episode, and arguably one of the most quoted lines the show had produced in years. Dan Greeny said he was tickled by all the attention. He also said he did not think it would trigger the long-awaited reevaluation of the episode he had been hoping for. He laughed when he said it. He understood that people were not suddenly realizing the episode was great. They were just shocked that the joke had a body attached to it now. That shock is real and worth taking seriously. Not because the writers saw the future. They did not. They saw the present, in the year 2000, and asked what the worst version of it might look like in 30 years. They picked Trump as their symbol of that worst version, not because they were prophets, but because he was already, in the culture of the year 2000, exactly what he appeared to be. The question that stays with you after all of this is not, how did they know? The question is, if a room full of comedy writers in the year 2000 could look at Donald Trump and immediately reach for him as their symbol of a country that had lost its mind, what does that say about everything that came after? What does it mean that the warning was always there, dressed up in cartoon clothes, on a Fox network show, in a mediocre episode that Entertainment Weekly called one of the worst the show ever made? It means the writers were paying attention. It means the country, for a long time, was not. __quote _1__. The Trump prediction is the most famous thing in this essay, and probably the most famous thing The Simpsons has ever accidentally gotten right. But the next case, the one from 2007, involves not a politician, but a room full of government employees with headphones on, listening to every phone call in America, and the whistleblower who proved 6 years later that this was not a joke at all. Section 3. NSA Mass Surveillance. In 2007, The Simpsons made it to the big screen. After 18 seasons on television, the show finally got a movie. It was called The Simpsons Movie. It was released on July 27, 2007, and it made over $527 million at the box office worldwide. It was, by almost every measure, a success. People laughed at the Spider-Pig song. They laughed at Bart skateboarding naked through Springfield. They bought the tickets and ate the popcorn and went home happy. Most of them did not think twice about a scene that lasted maybe 45 seconds in the middle of the film. The scene works like this. The Simpson family has escaped from Springfield, which has been sealed inside a giant glass dome by the government's Environmental Protection Agency. The family is now on the run. Marge and the kids are on a train. Marge, trying to keep everyone calm, says something out loud about a plan she has. She mentions wanting to expose what the government has been doing. It is a passing comment, a throwaway line in a conversation between a cartoon mother and her cartoon children on a cartoon train. Cut to Washington, D.C. Cut to a building labeled the National Security Agency. Inside the building is an enormous room, stretching back as far as the camera can see, filled with row after row of workers sitting at desks wearing headphones. Every single one of them is listening. The room is a machine built for one purpose: hearing everything every American citizen says. One of the workers, sitting in the middle of this massive operation, suddenly bolts upright. He tears off his headphones. He shouts across the room that after years of work, they have finally caught something they can actually use. He has just heard Marge Simpson's comment on the train. The whole operation swings into action. Within moments, government agents are closing in on the family. The joke lands because it is absurd. The idea that a government agency employing hundreds of people would have been listening specifically to Marge Simpson's private conversation, waiting years for her to say something useful, is ridiculous. It is also, in 2007, supposed to be fictional, a parody of paranoia, the kind of thing conspiracy theorists believed and sensible people found funny to laugh at. 6 years later, it was not funny anymore, or rather, it was still funny, but in a completely different way. In June 2013, a man named Edward Snowden contacted journalists and handed them a collection of classified documents from the National Security Agency of the United States government. What those documents revealed was that the NSA had been running a series of secret programs that collected information on ordinary American citizens on a massive scale. Phone calls, internet activity, emails. The agency had built partnerships with major technology and phone companies to access enormous amounts of private communication data. The programs had names. The operation was real. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was a fact, documented in the government's own paperwork, confirmed by the government's own former employee. The world reacted with shock. Politicians gave speeches. Privacy advocates raised alarms. Other countries expressed outrage. Snowden himself became one of the most debated figures in modern American history, with some people calling him a hero and others calling him a traitor. He was charged under a law covering spying and has lived outside the United States ever since. And the Simpsons clip from 2007 immediately started circulating again. The scene in the movie shows a room full of workers listening to the conversations of private American citizens. The real NSA had been doing something structurally very similar, not identical. The real program did not involve workers in headphones waiting for specific citizens to say something specific. It involved automated systems collecting vast amounts of data and flagging certain patterns. But the core image of a government agency treating the private communications of ordinary people as material to be gathered and searched was not a paranoid fantasy. It was policy. The Hollywood Reporter listed the NSA scene among the genuine Simpsons predictions that held up to scrutiny. Multiple outlets noted it in the weeks after Snowden's documents became public. Al Jean, the showrunner, was asked about it in various interviews during that period. His explanation followed the same pattern as his explanations for other predictions. The writers were not seeing the future. They were extrapolating from the present. They were taking something that existed in some smaller or less visible form and stretching it to its logical extreme for comic effect. And here is why that explanation actually makes the prediction more interesting, not less. By 2007, the year the movie came out, there had already been reporting on NSA surveillance activity. In 2005, the New York Times had published a story about a secret program in which the NSA was wiretapping communications involving American citizens without going through the standard legal process of getting a court to approve it first. The story caused controversy. There were congressional hearings. The Bush administration acknowledged the program existed, but defended it as legal and necessary for national security following the September 11th attacks. So, in 2007, when the Simpsons writers put a room full of NSA employees listening to citizens' phone calls into their movie, they were not making something up entirely. They were taking a controversy that was already in the news, already part of the public conversation, and amplifying it to cartoon proportions. The joke was not that the NSA was secretly listening to everyone. The joke was the absurdity of the scale, the image of a room that goes back forever, hundreds of workers, all of them waiting with headphones on, all of them treating every American conversation as potential evidence of something. That image, stretched for comic effect in 2007, turned out to be structurally closer to the truth than anyone watching the movie would have assumed. The Snowden documents showed that the NSA's programs were vast. They covered enormous numbers of people. The scale of what had been built, the infrastructure, the partnerships, the data collection, was larger than most people had imagined. The movie did not get the specific technology right, but it got the spirit of it right. The idea that the government had decided that private conversations were fair game, that ordinary people saying ordinary things on ordinary days were worth listening to, turned out to be accurate. There is a detail about this prediction that almost always gets left out of the conversation, and it is the most interesting part. The Simpsons movie was not the first time the show had made a joke about NSA surveillance. 7 years earlier, in a 1997 episode called El viaje misterioso de nuestro Homer, there is a quick visual gag involving an NSA sign. The joke is almost invisible, the kind of thing that flies by so fast most viewers do not consciously register it, but the writers had been thinking about government surveillance as a subject for comedy since at least 1997. By the time the movie came out in 2007, they had been sitting with the idea for a decade. This matters because it changes the story slightly. The NSA scene in the movie was not a sudden inspiration. It was the loudest version of something the writers had been returning to for years, which suggests that the people making The Simpsons were, for a long time, more alert to the possibility of government surveillance overreach than most of the public was. Not because they had inside information, because they were paying close attention to what governments do when given the opportunity to collect information, and they kept finding it funny, which usually means they also found it a little alarming. Edward Snowden himself, after his documents became public, was asked about the Simpsons comparison. According to reporting at the time, he acknowledged it, in the general spirit of the conversation, that the Simpsons had gotten there first. He was not surprised that a satirical cartoon had mapped the territory before a whistleblower did. Satire, done well, often works exactly that way. It finds the thing that is actually happening, or that is about to start happening, and it names it as a joke before it becomes serious enough to name as a fact. The scene in the movie is also technically very good at being a joke. It follows a specific comic structure. You are watching a domestic, ordinary moment, a mother on a train talking to her kids. Then the camera cuts to the most extreme possible version of the opposite thing. The gap between Marge's small, quiet comment and the enormous government machine that has apparently been waiting specifically for that comment is where the laugh lives. It is funny because the scale is insane. It is funny because the government is being shown as both terrifyingly powerful and completely ridiculous at the same time, spending all those resources waiting for Marge Simpson to say something useful. That combination, terrifying and ridiculous, is what the best Simpsons jokes about institutions always reach for. Mr. Burns' nuclear plant is terrifying and ridiculous. Mayor Quimby's corrupt administration is terrifying and ridiculous. The NSA scene in the movie fits the same shape. The joke is not that surveillance is bad. The joke is that the thing doing the surveillance is so enormous and so devoted and has apparently been doing this for years, and the best it has managed to catch is Marge Simpson. After Snowden's revelations, the joke did not stop being funny. If anything, it became funnier and more uncomfortable at the same time. Because now the room full of workers was not entirely fictional. The infrastructure was real. The scale was real. The idea that private conversations were being treated as data to be collected and searched was real. The movie had dressed it up in cartoon colors and played it for laughs, but the structure underneath the joke turned out to be something the government had actually built. Al Jean's standard explanation for predictions, that they are educated guesses, that the writers throw enough darts and some hit the board, is honest and probably correct in most cases. But the NSA scene is slightly different from something like the Trump prediction or the FIFA corruption call, because it was not built on a completely fictional foundation. It was built on reporting that already existed. The writers looked at a real controversy that was already in the news in 2005, decided it was funny and scary enough to put in a movie, stretched it to its most extreme form, and then 6 years later, a whistleblower confirmed that the extreme form was actually fairly close to what was happening. That is not prophecy. But it is something. It is what happens when people who are paying very close attention to the world take what they see and follow it to its logical end. The logic said, if a government agency can listen to some calls, it will eventually listen to as many as it possibly can. The Simpsons followed that logic and turned it into a joke. Snowden followed that logic and found that it was not a joke at all. The Simpsons movie gave audiences Spider Pig. It gave them Bart skateboarding. It gave them a story about Homer polluting a lake and nearly destroying his family and his town. And tucked inside all of that, for about 45 seconds, it gave them an image of a government that had decided every private conversation was its business. Most people laughed and forgot about it. 6 years later, it turned out the government had not forgotten about it at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That brings us to a case that is older, simpler, and in some ways the most purely strange of all the ones in this essay. Because the next section is not about politics or surveillance programs or anything as large as a pandemic. It is about two men, a white tiger, a Las Vegas stage, and the very specific reason the Simpsons writers looked at that situation in 1993 and thought, yeah, that is going to go wrong eventually. Section 4. The Siegfried and Roy Tiger Attack. There is a version of this story that gets told quickly. The Simpsons showed a tiger attacking its trainers in 1993. 10 years later, a tiger attacked its trainers in real life. Spooky. Next. That version is not wrong, but it skips over everything that makes this case worth actually sitting with. Because the Siegfried and Roy prediction is not just a case of a cartoon showing something before it happened. It is a case of a cartoon showing something, the writers explaining exactly why they showed it, and then the exact thing they described happening a decade later to the exact kind of people they were describing. The writers themselves, when asked about it after the real attack, said it was bound to happen sooner or later, and that phrase, bound to happen sooner or later, is the whole story. Start with who Siegfried and Roy actually were. Siegfried Fischbacher and Roy Horn were two German-born performers who built one of the most successful live shows in Las Vegas history. Siegfried handled the magic. Roy handled the animals. Together they had been working with big cats, lions, cheetahs, and eventually white tigers and white lions since the 1950s. By the time they reached Las Vegas in the 1990s, their show at the Mirage Hotel was one of the most famous and most attended in the city. They had performed with wild animals for decades. Their white tigers were famous. Their show ran 6 nights a week. They were, by any measure, the biggest animal act in the world. They were also, by the nature of what they did, working every single night with animals that weighed hundreds of pounds and were built by millions of years of evolution to hunt and kill. The Simpsons writers knew this. Everyone knew this. That is precisely why the joke existed. The episode is called Springfield, with a $sign instead of the S, and the full title is long. Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. It is Season 5, Episode 10. It aired on December 16th, 1993. The main story of the episode is about Springfield voting to legalize gambling, which leads to a casino being opened by Mr. Burns. The casino becomes a central location for the episode, which means the writers needed to populate it with the kinds of things you find in a casino. big entertainment acts, flashy performers, the kind of show that people in a gambling city would pay to see. Enter Gunter and Ernst. Gunter and Ernst are the Simpsons version of Siegfried and Roy. They are German, they are flamboyant, they work with exotic big cats. Their tiger is named Anastasia. The show does not try to disguise what it is doing. Gunter and Ernst are an open parody of the real duo, designed to look and feel like the Simpsons version of a Las Vegas animal magic act. They appear in the episode as a joke about the kind of spectacle you associate with that world. Near the end of the episode, Anastasia the white tiger attacks them during their performance. The attack is played for comedy. It is a cartoon. The tiger goes for them, and that is essentially the end of the scene. Nobody in 1993 watching this episode was meant to walk away thinking about real danger. They were meant to laugh at the absurdity of an expensive Las Vegas act going spectacularly wrong in front of an audience. Now jump forward exactly 10 years. On October 3, 2003, Roy Horn was performing at the Mirage in Las Vegas with a 7-year-old white Bengal tiger named Manticore. It was Roy's 59th birthday. The show was in progress in front of a live audience. At some point during the performance, Manticore grabbed Roy's sleeve in its mouth. What happened next is still debated. Some witnesses said the tiger was distracted by something in the audience and grabbed Roy to try to move him, the way a mother cat moves a kitten. Others described it more simply as an attack. What is not debated is what the tiger did next. It bit Roy on the neck and dragged him off stage. Roy Horn weighed about 160 pounds. Manticore weighed around 380 pounds. The bite severed Roy's spine in part. He lost an enormous amount of blood. He was rushed to the hospital and came close to dying that night. He survived, but the damage was severe. He lost the ability to walk and talk for a period, and though he recovered significantly over the years that followed, he was never the same. The show at the Mirage, which had been running for years and was one of the most successful entertainment acts in Las Vegas history, ended that night. It never came back. Siegfried and Roy performed one final brief show with Manticore in 2009 before retiring permanently. Roy Horn died on May 8, 2020 from complications related to COVID-19. Siegfried Fischbacher died on January 13, 2021 from pancreatic cancer. The parallels between the real event and the Simpsons episode are specific enough to be genuinely strange. Both involved German performers. Both involved a white tiger. Both took place on a Las Vegas stage during a live performance. In the episode, the attack ends the act. In real life, the attack ended the act permanently. The show drew on a clear and direct parody of the real duo, made no attempt to disguise the reference, and then the thing that happened to the fictional characters happened to the real people it was based on a decade later. Now here's the part that most articles covering this prediction leave out, because it is the part that actually explains it. When the Season 5 DVD was released, and journalists asked the Simpsons production team about the tiger attack prediction, the response was not amazement. It was not, "Oh wow, we really called that one." The response was a shrug. The production team said it was bound to happen sooner or later. That reaction is the key to understanding what this case is actually about. The writers put a tiger attack in that episode not because they had any special knowledge of what was coming. They put it there because they were writing about people who work up close with large, wild predators every night in front of an audience. And the logical endpoint of that profession, given enough time, is that something goes wrong. Tigers are not domesticated animals. They are not dogs. They are not animals that have been bred over thousands of years to live alongside humans and read human social signals. They are apex hunters. They are powerful, unpredictable, and built to do things that involve teeth and force. Training can shape behavior. It cannot remove instinct. The writers looked at Siegfried and Roy in 1993, saw two men who had been working closely with large wild cats for decades, and concluded that a tiger was eventually going to do something a tiger does. They wrote that as a joke because in 1993 it had not happened yet, so it still lived in the territory of comedy. It would have been much less funny to write it in 2003 after it actually happened to real people. But the underlying reasoning was not funny. It was just correct. When you put human beings in close proximity to large predators night after night, year after year, for decades, the probability that something goes badly wrong does not disappear. It accumulates. Every night the show runs is another night the tiger could do something unexpected. The writers understood this. They thought it was funny. Then they were right. This is worth separating from some of the other predictions in this essay. The Trump prediction, for example, required the writers to imagine a political future that had not happened and that most people would have called unlikely. The Osaka flu comparison required finding structural similarities between a fictional cartoon disease and a real global pandemic. Those cases involve a degree of imagination about things that were not obviously going to happen. The Siegfried and Roy case does not require imagination. It requires arithmetic. The writers added up what they knew: exotic animal trainers, large predators, nightly performances over many years, and concluded that the sum was eventually going to include an attack. They were not predicting anything mysterious. They were stating an obvious truth in the form of a joke. The fact that the real attack did not happen until 10 years after the episode aired does not change what the joke was actually saying. What makes it feel like a prediction is the specificity. It was not just any animal attack. It was a white tiger. It was a Las Vegas stage. It was during a performance. It was directed at the famous German duo who were the most well-known animal act in the world. Every detail of the fictional version matched the real version closely enough that when people saw the comparison, it felt less like coincidence and more like something else. But the production team's response tells you what it actually was. Obvious, in the way that some outcomes are obvious long before they arrive. There is something else about this case that gets almost no attention. Manticore, the tiger who attacked Roy, was not killed after the attack. This is unusual. In the United States, when an animal causes serious injury to a person, the standard response is often to put the animal down. Roy Horn, from his hospital bed, specifically asked that Manticore not be harmed. He made this request in writing while he was still recovering. Manticore lived out the rest of his natural life and died in 2014, about 11 years after the attack. That detail does not appear in the Simpsons episode. The cartoon version ends with the attack and moves on, but the real version includes something the cartoon could not have predicted: that the man who was nearly killed by his tiger spent years afterward making sure that tiger was protected. The Simpsons, in 1993, made a joke about a famous Las Vegas act getting mauled by their own white tiger. The production team, looking back on it after it actually happened, said it was bound to happen sooner or later. Those two responses together tell you everything you need to know about what kind of prediction this was. Not a vision, not a guess pulled from thin air. Just a logical conclusion drawn from a situation that had been pointing toward that conclusion for a very long time. The attack was always in the math. The writers saw it before the math finished calculating. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that brings us to a prediction that required no math at all. No logic, no calculation, no reading of where a dangerous situation was headed. The next case is a sign on a wall, a joke tucked into the corner of a single frame that named a corporate deal worth over $50 billion 19 years before that deal was announced. Section 5. The Disney-Fox Merger. On November 8, 1998, The Simpsons aired an episode called When You Dish Upon a Star. It was Season 10, Episode 5. The main story involves Homer accidentally crashing into the Lake Springfield home of two famous Hollywood celebrities, Alec Baldwin and his then-wife, Kim Basinger. They have moved to Springfield specifically to escape the attention that comes with being famous. Homer, being Homer, immediately tells everyone in town. The episode ends with the celebrities leaving Springfield and Homer being banned from ever bothering a celebrity again. It is not a particularly famous episode. It does not rank among the all-time greats. Most people who saw it in 1998 have probably forgotten the broad strokes of the plot, let alone the specific details of individual scenes. Near the end of the episode, Ron Howard, who appeared in the episode as a guest, takes one of Homer's movie ideas and pitches it to 20th Century Fox. The scene cuts to the outside of the Fox studio building. There is a sign on the front of the building showing the 20th Century Fox logo. Underneath it, in smaller text, are the words, "A division of Walt Disney Company." The shot lasts for a moment. It is a background detail. It is not the point of the scene. The point of the scene is Ron Howard pitching a ridiculous movie concept, and the sign is just part of the establishing shot that tells the audience where the scene is set. Nobody in 1998 would have looked at that sign and thought they were seeing anything other than a quick joke about corporate consolidation. Disney had bought the ABC television network and its parent company in 1995, which was a big deal at the time. The joke was a riff on the idea that Disney was slowly buying up everything in the entertainment industry. On December 14th, 2017, Disney announced it was buying a massive portion of 21st Century Fox, including 20th Century Fox, for $52.4 billion. The deal was officially completed in March 2019. The Simpsons, a show made by 20th Century Fox Television, became part of the Disney family. The sign that had been a joke in 1998 became the legal reality in 2019. ESPN reporter Darren Rovell was one of the first to share the screenshot from the 1998 episode on Twitter the day the merger was announced. Within hours, it had spread everywhere. Al Jean, the showrunner, responded to the news on Twitter with a characteristic lack of drama. He wrote, "I predict people will make far too much of this mere coincidence." He was probably right. People did make a lot of it. But the story behind how the sign ended up in the episode is more interesting than either the prediction itself or Gene's dismissal of it. The episode was written by Richard Appel, and the Fox studio exterior scene was directed by Pete Michaels. When journalists reached out to Apple after the merger announcement, he said he did not remember exactly how the gag came about, other than a general sense that soon Disney would own us all. He also added, with the kind of dry humor you would expect from a Simpsons writer, "Personally, I am not for sale, unless it is a really good offer." Mike Scully, who was the showrunner at the time the episode was made, gave a more specific explanation. He said the sign was needed as a joke for an exterior shot of 20th Century Fox, where Ron Howard was inside pitching a movie. Disney had bought Cap Cities/ABC a couple of years earlier, so the joke was a reference to that deal, and in Scully's words, to 20 years in the future when they knew they would all end up working for Disney. That explanation is worth reading carefully. Scully is saying that in 1998, the Simpsons writers assumed Disney would eventually own them, not as a specific prediction about a specific deal on a specific date, as a general assumption about where the entertainment industry was headed. They had watched Disney buy ABC in 1995 and concluded that the logical direction of travel was more consolidation, bigger purchases, and eventually everything belonging to a smaller number of very large companies. They put that assumption in a sign, made it a background joke, and went back to writing about Ron Howard and a ridiculous movie pitch. The sign also contained another detail that almost nobody talks about when the Disney Fox prediction comes up. Inside the Fox building, in the same scene, there is a Star Wars poster visible on the wall of the office where Ron Howard is pitching the film. Disney bought Lucasfilm, which owns Star Wars, in 2012, 14 years before the Fox deal. And Ron Howard, who appears in the episode, went on to direct Solo, a Star Wars story, in 2018, 1 year after the Fox merger was announced. None of that was planned. None of it was intentional. But the combination of details in that single scene, the Disney Fox sign and the Star Wars poster, sitting in the same frame in 1998, is the kind of thing that makes people look twice. This is one of the cleaner predictions in this essay in terms of the facts being verifiable and specific. The episode aired on a confirmed date, the sign contained specific words, the merger happened on a confirmed date, the words on the sign matched the reality of the merger. There is no ambiguity about the connection, no debate about whether the comparison is a stretch. A Simpsons episode showed 20th Century Fox as a division of Walt Disney Company in 1998, and that became true in 2019. The gap was 21 years. What makes this case interesting beyond the basic facts is what it reveals about how the writers thought about the show's own position in the world. The Simpsons was made by 20th Century Fox Television. It aired on Fox Broadcasting, which was also part of the same corporate family. The writers were, in other words, employees of the company they were joking about. Putting a sign on a Fox building that described Fox as a division of Walt Disney Company was a joke at the expense of their own employer, suggesting that their employer would eventually be absorbed by a competitor. This is not the kind of joke that gets made by people who are either completely naive about the entertainment industry or completely comfortable with the idea of saying the quiet part out loud in a background visual gag. The Simpsons has always had a complicated relationship with Fox. The show made jokes at the network's expense regularly throughout its run. There were gags about Fox's programming choices, about the network's ownership, about the direction the company was heading. This was tolerated, mostly, because the show was enormously successful, and because the jokes were usually dressed up in enough layers of absurdity that they could be dismissed as just being silly. The Disney sign is that tradition taken to its logical extreme. The writers looked at their own corporate home and decided to joke that it would eventually belong to someone else. 2 decades later, it did. There is also a practical element to this story that grounds it in something less mysterious than prediction. In the mid-1990s, the consolidation of media companies was a visible and ongoing process. Disney buying ABC was one example. There were others. Large companies were getting larger by buying smaller ones. The entertainment industry was visibly contracting into a smaller number of very large players. Any working writer in Hollywood in 1998 could look at that trend and reasonably assume it would continue. The specific target of Disney buying Fox was not obvious, but the general direction, more consolidation, fewer independent companies, larger and larger corporate structures, was not hard to see. The writers of The Simpsons, who were working inside one of the companies most likely to be affected by that trend, saw it clearly enough to put it in a sign. They treated it as so obvious that it did not even need to be the point of the joke. The sign is set dressing. The joke is about Ron Howard and a ridiculous movie concept. The Disney-Fox future is just there in the background, waiting. Executive producer Al Jean's response to the merger, that people would make too much of it, reflects his consistent position on all of these predictions. He has always said the same thing. Educated guesses. Enough darts, enough bullseyes. The show has been making jokes about everything for long enough that some of them are going to land on something real. He is not being falsely modest when he says this. He genuinely seems to believe it, and he is probably right as a general principle. But the Disney-Fox case is worth looking at more carefully than Jean's dismissal suggests, not because it proves the writers were psychic, but because of what it shows about the quality of the observation underneath the joke. Scully said directly that in 1998, he knew they would all end up working for Disney eventually. That is not a random guess. That is a conclusion drawn from watching an industry carefully. The sign is not a prediction in the way that most people use that word. It is a statement of the obvious, made 21 years before the obvious thing happened, which means the gap between the sign and the merger is not really a measure of how far ahead the writers were seeing. It is a measure of how slowly the thing they had already understood took to actually arrive. The entertainment industry consolidated. The Simpsons said it would. The entertainment industry consolidated on the specific axis they described, with Disney absorbing Fox. The sign was right. The writers did not find this particularly surprising. What surprised them, maybe, was how long it took. That is the Disney-Fox prediction, a background joke, a sign on a building, a throwaway visual gag in a season 10 episode that most people have forgotten, that described a $52 billion corporate merger 21 years before it happened. The writers knew it was coming. They just did not know when. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, for, underscore, underscore. What comes next is different in almost every way. Instead of a corporate sign slipped into the background of a scene, the next prediction is a single line of text running across the bottom of a screen during a fake news broadcast. 4 words. And those 4 words described, in 2012, something that would become one of the biggest economic disasters to hit a country in modern history. Section 6, the FIFA corruption scandal. On March 30th, 2014, The Simpsons aired an episode called You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee. It was season 25, episode 16. The episode begins at Springfield Elementary, where Superintendent Chalmers decides the students need to learn more about respect. A speech contest is organized. Students are asked to talk about someone they admire. Lisa, after some back and forth, ends up giving a speech about Homer. She describes him as a man of extraordinary honesty and integrity. The speech goes viral online. And because of it, Homer gets a phone call from the World Football Federation, the show's version of FIFA, which is the real organization that runs international soccer. The World Football Federation is looking for an honest referee. The reason they are looking for one is stated plainly in the episode. The organization is completely rotten with corruption. Referees take bribes, officials take bribes, the whole system is built around money changing hands under the table. They need someone so genuinely, almost stupidly honest that no amount of money will move him. Homer Simpson, a man who has been described as many things over 25 seasons, fits that particular need because he has no idea what is going on around him most of the time. The family travels to Brazil for the 2014 World Cup. Homer referees matches. Gangsters try to bribe him. Players try to bribe him. Officials try to bribe him. For most of the episode, Homer holds firm. He does not take the money. He is Lisa's hero, and he wants to stay that way. The World Football Federation's own vice president, who arrived at the Simpson home earlier in the episode to recruit Homer, was arrested for corruption in the middle of the conversation. He was being recruited to find an honest referee, while he himself was under investigation for being dishonest. He gets handcuffed and taken away while still making his pitch to Homer. The scene is played for a quick laugh, and then the story moves on. 14 months later, the joke was not a joke anymore. On May 27th, 2015, United States federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against 14 current and former officials of FIFA, which stands for the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, the real governing body of world soccer. The charges included corruption, taking bribes, money laundering, and fraud. Several of the highest-ranking officials in the organization were arrested at a hotel in Zurich, Switzerland, where they had gathered for a FIFA meeting. The arrests were coordinated between American law enforcement and Swiss authorities. Among those charged and arrested were multiple FIFA vice presidents, the same title held by the fictional World Football Federation official who got handcuffed in the middle of Homer's living room in the Simpsons episode 14 months earlier. The scale of the real scandal was enormous. The charges covered decades of corruption. Prosecutors alleged that soccer officials had been taking bribes in exchange for awarding broadcasting rights and tournament hosting rights to various companies and countries. The total amount of money involved in the alleged corruption ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. The scandal led to the resignation assassination of FIFA's longtime president. It triggered investigations in multiple countries. It produced years of legal proceedings. It was, by any measure, one of the biggest corruption scandals in the history of international sports. The Simpsons episode had shown a fictional version of exactly this: a soccer governing body so completely corrupt that its own vice president was actively committing crimes while trying to find someone honest enough to clean the organization's image. The joke in the episode was the irony of that situation: an organization built on corruption reaching out for integrity. The joke in real life turned out to be that the real organization had been doing something very similar for a very long time. TV Tropes, which maintains detailed episode notes for The Simpsons, includes a specific observation in its recap of this episode. It notes that the episode's premise was based around FIFA corruption scandals that had been circulating in sports journalism for some time, but had not yet reached their peak. It also notes that the scandal reached that peak the following year, which made the episode appear far more prophetic than it might otherwise have seemed. That observation matters because it describes the same mechanism that explains many of the predictions in this essay. The writers were not imagining something that had never been suggested. They were writing about something that was already being reported on in sports journalism, already known to people who followed soccer closely, already the subject of investigations that had been running for years. The Simpsons amplified it, made it a cartoon, gave it Homer Simpson as its central honest figure, and aired it over a year before the arrests happened. But here is the layer of this story that goes beyond the basic corruption prediction, because the episode actually got something else right on top of it, and almost nobody talks about this part. The episode predicted Germany as the winner of the 2014 World Cup. In the episode, Homer ultimately takes a bribe and throws the World Cup final in favor of Brazil. Germany wins instead. The episode aired on March 30th, 2014. The actual 2014 World Cup final was played on July 13th, 2014, 3.5 months later. Germany defeated Argentina 1-0 to win the tournament. They did not play Brazil in the final, as the episode suggested, but the episode correctly identified Germany as the team that would win the cup that year. The German victory in the 2014 World Cup was not a certainty in March. Brazil was the host nation and a perennial favorite. The tournament had not been played yet. Germany's victory was not obviously predictable to the general public at the time the episode aired. And yet the writers, in building their story, chose Germany as the team that wins the World Cup in their fictional tournament that year. They were right. Now, to be fair, the writers were not necessarily making a serious prediction about the tournament outcome. They were constructing a story in which Homer throws the final in favor of Brazil, which means Brazil needed to lose for the story to work the way they wanted it to. If Brazil loses, somebody else wins. The writers picked Germany. That Germany then actually won the real tournament is the kind of overlap that happens when you are producing content about a real event that has not happened yet. You have to pick someone. Sometimes you pick right. But the combination of the two things, the corruption scandal and the tournament winner sitting inside the same episode, gives it a density of accuracy that is unusual even by Simpsons standards. There is also a scene in the episode that captures something true about how soccer corruption actually functioned, which is separate from whether the writers knew specific arrests were coming. In the episode, bribes are offered constantly by multiple different people with no coordination and no particular plan. Gangsters offer cash. Players offer deals. Officials make arrangements. The corruption is not organized into a single, clean conspiracy. It is everywhere, coming from all directions, almost like a feature of the environment rather than a specific scheme. Everyone in the ecosystem of the sport assumes that money will be exchanged and that results can be influenced. It is presented as the water the characters swim in rather than a specific bad act by a specific bad person. The real FIFA corruption, as described by American prosecutors, functions similarly. It was not one person doing one bad thing. It was a culture. Multiple officials over multiple decades across multiple continents, all operating within a system where bribes were expected and delivered. The charges covered conduct going back to the 1990s. The corruption was not a scandal in the sense of a sudden surprise. It was a structure that had been in place for a long time and had simply not been prosecuted yet. The episode captured that structural reality, probably because the writers had been reading the sports journalism that was already describing it in the years before 2014. The episode also contains one detail that is worth noting simply because it is so specific. The World Football Federation official who comes to Homer's house and gets arrested mid-conversation is not just caught for vague wrongdoing. He is caught specifically for corruption related to his role in the organization he is supposed to be representing. He is, in the language of the real charges filed a year later, exactly the kind of official that American prosecutors were describing when they announced the FIFA indictments. A senior figure, a vice president level person, someone with enough power and enough access to have been doing this for a long time. The scene is about 10 seconds long. He walks in, makes his pitch about needing an honest man, and gets handcuffed. The Simpsons plays it as a quick joke and moves on. In May 2015, multiple real FIFA vice presidents were handcuffed in a hotel in Zurich. The BBC covered the episode's prescience when the arrests were announced. Fox Sports covered it. Multiple sports journalists pointed out the comparison. The episode had aired close enough to the real events, 14 months, that it was still recent enough for people to remember it. This is slightly different from some of the other predictions in this essay, where the gap between the episode and the real event was years or even decades. 14 months is close enough that the connection felt immediate rather than historical. Al Jean's standard response applies here as it does everywhere. Educated guesses. Enough darts. The writers were following a story that was already in the news and took it to its logical conclusion in cartoon form. FIFA's corruption problems were not a secret in 2014. They had been discussed in European sports journalism for years. Various investigations had been underway. The writers picked up on the public reporting and built a story around it. What they did not know was that 14 months after their episode aired, federal prosecutors in the United States would take the story further than almost anyone had predicted, filing criminal charges against more than a dozen officials and triggering the biggest crisis in the organization's history. The episode is remembered now as a prediction. At the time it aired, it was a story about Homer Simpson trying to be a good person for his daughter's sake in a system designed to make good people fail. That is the actual subject of the episode. The corruption is the backdrop. The real story is about Homer and Lisa, about a father trying to live up to what his daughter believes about him, and about what happens when the world makes that harder than it should be. The writers built a piece of human drama and set it inside a world they had read enough about to know was rotten. The rottenness turned out to be more precisely real than they probably expected. That is the FIFA prediction. A corrupt soccer organization, a vice president arrested mid-conversation, a German World Cup victory, and a piece of sports journalism that the Simpsons writers had been paying attention to, all arriving in the same 22-minute episode a year before the real arrests made front pages around the world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next is smaller and stranger. Not a political scandal, or a corporate merger, or a sporting corruption case. Just 5 words running along the bottom of a television screen in 2012, describing a country's economic disaster 3 years before that disaster peaked. 5 words about an entire nation being put up for sale. Section 7, the Greek financial crisis. On January 8, 2012, The Simpsons aired an episode called Politically Inept with Homer Simpson. It was Season 23, Episode 10. The story begins on an airplane. Homer is flying home from a family trip, and the airline keeps delaying the flight, moving passengers around, treating everyone badly, and generally making the experience as miserable as possible. Homer loses his temper. He starts ranting. Another passenger films him on their phone. The video goes online. It spreads everywhere. Homer becomes a viral sensation overnight, a man who said what everyone was already thinking about how airlines treat their customers. A television producer sees the video and offers Homer his own political talk show on a cable news channel. Homer, who has no qualifications, no political knowledge, and no particular opinions beyond a strong preference for donuts and a strong dislike of inconvenience, becomes a television pundit. He gets a desk and a camera and an audience. He starts influencing public opinion. Republican Party officials eventually approach him and ask him to help choose their presidential candidate for the upcoming election. Homer picks Ted Nugent. The whole thing collapses when Homer admits on air that everything he has been saying is nonsense and that he is, in his own words, full of crap. That is the main story. It is a satire about how cable news works, about how anger drives ratings, about how a person with no expertise can become a political voice simply by being loud and relatable at the right moment. The episode is about the machinery of outrage media and how easily it can be pointed at anything and anyone. But the episode is remembered for something that has nothing to do with Homer's political career. At one point in the episode, Homer is on the set of his show. He is a guest on a news program, sitting at a desk, being interviewed. The show is a parody of cable news, with the kind of rolling text along the bottom of the screen that real news channels use to give viewers additional information while the main broadcast is happening. That text, called a ticker, scrolls across the screen while Homer is talking. Most viewers watching in January 2012 would have glanced at it and moved on. The ticker reads, "Europe puts Greece on eBay." 5 words. A joke. A throwaway visual gag designed to make the episode feel like a real news broadcast by giving the fake news channel the kind of absurd headline that the show's writers felt real cable news was already producing. It is not a prediction in the sense that anyone sat down and said, "We think Greece is going to have a financial crisis." It is a joke about European economic anxiety that was already visible in 2012, dressed up in the most ridiculous possible clothing. Putting an entire country on the auction website eBay is funny because it is absurd. Countries cannot be sold on eBay, except that what happened to Greece over the following 3 years was not entirely different from the joke's underlying logic. To understand why this comparison landed the way it did when people started making it in 2015, it helps to understand what actually happened to Greece. Greece is a country in southern Europe. It is a member of the European Union, which is a group of countries that share certain economic and political agreements. In 2009, it became clear that Greece had been borrowing far more money than it could pay back. The country's debts were enormous. The government had been spending more than it was bringing in for years, and the gap had become impossible to manage. Greece could not make its loan payments. It was in serious financial trouble. What followed was years of negotiations, bailouts, and conditions. Other European countries, led largely by Germany, along with international financial organizations, agreed to lend Greece enormous sums of money to prevent the country from completely collapsing. But those loans came with conditions. Greece had to cut spending. It had to raise taxes. It had to reduce the salaries of government workers. It had to make its economy smaller and harder in exchange for the money it needed to survive. And it had to sell things. This is the part of the Greek crisis that connects to the Simpsons joke. As a condition of receiving bailout money, Greece was required to privatize large portions of what had previously been government-owned. Airports were sold to private companies. A major port, the port of Piraeus, was sold to a Chinese shipping company. Real estate holdings were sold off. State-owned businesses were transferred to private ownership. Greece did not literally go on eBay, but the process of a country being required to sell off its national assets to meet the demands of its creditors is not entirely unlike the absurdist image the ticker was describing. The joke that countries do not go on eBay turned out to be pointing at a process that, while not identical to an eBay auction, had the same basic shape, something that belonged to a nation being sold to whoever had the money to buy it. In June 2015, Greece became the first developed nation to fail to make a payment to the International Monetary Fund, which is one of the major international financial organizations that had been involved in managing the crisis. This was treated as a massive event in global financial news. No wealthy country had ever done this before. Greece was on the edge of being forced out of the group of countries that use the euro as their currency. There were genuine fears about what that would mean for the rest of Europe. The Simpsons ticker from January 2012 started circulating again. The comparison was made by multiple outlets. The joke had aired 3.5 years before the peak of the crisis, at a time when the crisis was already visible and already being reported on, but had not yet reached its most dramatic point. The honest accounting of this prediction follows the same pattern as several others in this essay. The Greek financial crisis was not invisible in January 2012. It had been in the news since 2010. European leaders had been meeting about it for years. The general shape of the problem, a European country that had borrowed too much money and could not pay it back, was something anyone following the news would have known about. The Simpsons writers knew about it. They put it in a ticker joke because it was the kind of thing that cable news was already covering constantly, and a fake news channel that does not include a Greece joke in early 2012 is not doing its job as a parody. The joke is not a prediction in the sense of the writers imagining something that had not been suggested yet. It is a prediction in the sense that the writers took something real and pushed it slightly past where reality had gone at that moment. In January 2012, Greece was in trouble. The joke said Greece was in so much trouble that Europe was selling it on eBay. In 2015, Greece was in so much trouble that it was selling airports and ports and real estate to keep itself afloat. The direction of the joke was right, the specific form was wrong. Countries do not go on eBay, but the underlying condition of a country being dismantled piece by piece to satisfy its creditors is not far from the image the ticker was playing with. There is something else about this case that is worth pausing on, and it is different from anything discussed so far in this essay. The ticker joke in Politically Inept with Homer Simpson is not the focus of the episode. It is not even visible for long. It runs across the bottom of the screen while the main broadcast is happening, and a viewer who is paying close attention to what Homer was saying would have missed it entirely. The only reason people noticed it was because Simpsons fans have always been the kind of audience that watches carefully, that pauses and rewinds, that catalogs freeze-frame details and background jokes that most people would never catch. The Simpsons has been doing this for its entire run. Background signs, ticker text, newspaper headlines, posters in the background of scenes. These have always carried jokes that are invisible to casual viewers, but reward people who look closely. The Disney Fox sign discussed in the previous section is another example of this. The show's writers have always written for two audiences simultaneously, the people watching normally and the people watching very carefully. The Greek ticker is part of that tradition. It was put there for the careful watchers. The writers knew someone would see it. They did not know that 3.5 years later that someone would be sharing it as a prediction of an actual financial catastrophe. What this means, practically, is that The Simpsons has been producing a constant, low-level stream of small observations about the state of the world, tucked into backgrounds and tickers and freeze-frame details for over 30 years. Most of them go nowhere. The world does not catch up to them. But occasionally one of them connects with something real, and because it was always there in the background, quietly waiting, the connection looks more deliberate than it was. The Greek crisis ticker is one of those moments. It was always there. The world moved toward it. When the world arrived at the place the joke was pointing at, the joke suddenly looked like a prediction. That is the mechanism. Not prophecy, not even especially sharp foresight, just an enormous amount of small observations about the world, distributed across thousands of background details over decades, waiting for reality to catch up to enough of them. The Simpsons writers who put Europe puts Greece on eBay in a ticker in January 2012 were not sitting around a table saying, "We think Greece is going to have a catastrophic debt crisis in 3 years." They were saying Greece is already in economic trouble, and that is the kind of thing a fake cable news channel would reduce to a 5-word joke. They were right about that. The fake cable news channel joke turned out to be pointing at something real. Not because anyone at the show saw the future, because they were paying close enough attention to the present to know which direction things were already going. The crisis itself left real damage that lasted years. Unemployment in Greece rose dramatically. Young people left the country in large numbers looking for work elsewhere. Wages fell. Pensions were cut. The healthcare system came under severe strain. The human cost of what the ticker joke was describing in 5 words was enormous and lasted well past the peak year of 2015 that most of the coverage focused on. The Simpsons did not see any of that. The ticker is not a comment on the human cost of the crisis. It is a joke about the political theater surrounding it, about the way that European leaders discussing what to do about Greece sounded, from the outside, like they were treating a country as a problem to be managed rather than a population to be helped. The eBay image captures the dehumanizing logic of that kind of financial negotiation, where assets are assets and people are not really part of the conversation. That might be the sharpest thing about this particular joke, sharper than whether it predicted anything specific. The image of Europe putting Greece on eBay is funny and dark at the same time, because it names something true about how powerful financial institutions treat struggling countries, not as communities of people, but as collections of sellable things. The joke is mean, in the specific way that good satire is mean. It is mean about the right target, the Greek financial crisis. 5 words in a ticker. 3.5 years before the worst of it arrived. The writers were not prophets. They were just paying attention. __, quote _ 6 __. And now we come to the case that feels the strangest of all. Not because the prediction was the most accurate or the most specific, but because even the people who made it cannot fully explain it. A single frame, lasting less than a second, from a 1997 episode that contained an image that nobody in 1997 could have intended to mean what it appears to mean. The next section is about September 11th, and about what it actually means when something looks like a prediction, but cannot possibly have been one. Section 8, the 9/11 imagery. On September 21st, 1997, The Simpsons aired the first episode of its 9th season. It was called The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, Season 9, Episode 1. The story is straightforward. Barney, after a night of heavy drinking, borrows Homer's car and disappears for 2 months. The car turns up in New York City, clamped to a post in the plaza between the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. Homer, who had a bad experience in New York years earlier and hates the city deeply, has to go there to retrieve it. The episode is set almost entirely in New York. The family splits up to enjoy the city while Homer waits at his car for a parking officer to remove the clamp. The city is drawn with obvious affection. The skyline is detailed. The landmarks are recognizable. The World Trade Center, with its two identical towers rising above the surrounding streets, is the physical center of the episode's main story. Homer spends a large portion of the episode stuck at its base, eating food from a street vendor, desperately needing a bathroom, and accumulating more parking tickets every time he steps away from the car. The episode was loved by critics. IGN named it the best episode of the 9th season. It won a Primetime Emmy Award for one of its original songs. It was, by any standard, a well-regarded piece of television. 4 years later, on September 11, 2001, hijacked commercial airplanes were flown into the World Trade Center's two towers. Both towers collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people died. It was the deadliest attack on American soil in the country's history. The world changed in the hours and days that followed, in ways that are still felt today. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was immediately pulled from syndication. It did not air again until 2006, 5 years later, and when it returned, several scenes had been edited out, including a joke in which a character says they stick all the jerks in Tower 1. The episode's heavy use of the World Trade Center as a backdrop, the thing that had made it feel grounded and specific and real in 1997, made it unwatchable in the immediate aftermath of 2001. The towers that had been a visual anchor for the episode were gone. In the years after the attacks, people going back through the episode began noticing something. There is a moment in the episode where a character holds up a brochure advertising a bus trip to New York City. The price on the brochure is $9. The design of the brochure places the number 9 on the left side, and directly behind it, forming the visual background of the image, are the two towers of the World Trade Center standing side by side. The two towers, rendered in the brochure's simple graphic style, look like the number 11. The 9 and the 11 are sitting next to each other in the same image. 9, 11, 9, 11. Screenshots of this moment began circulating online, initially around 2008, and accelerating in subsequent years. The image was shared on social media with language suggesting the show had predicted the attacks. Conspiracy theory communities pointed to it as evidence of something deliberate, something planned, an example of what some people call predictive programming. The idea that governments or powerful organizations hide warnings about future events in popular entertainment before those events occur. The people who made the episode have been asked about this image many times. Their responses are consistent and worth quoting directly. Al Jean, who has been the showrunner of The Simpsons since 2001 and who was one of the show's original writers, spoke about it in an interview with the New York Times in 2018. He said, "There is a frame where there's a brochure that says New York at $9 a day, and behind the 9 are the Twin Towers. So they look like an 11, and it looks like a 9/11. That one is a completely bizarre, strange thing. Gene did not claim it was intentional. He did not explain it away as meaningless. He called it bizarre. He said he found it strange." Coming from a man who has consistently downplayed most Simpsons predictions as coincidence or educated guesses, that reaction is notable. He genuinely could not explain it. Bill Oakley, who co-wrote the episode and was a showrunner at the time it was produced, gave a more grounded explanation when he responded to coverage of the image in 2010. He said the $9 figure was chosen because it was a comically cheap fare. You would advertise a New York bus trip for $9 because $9 is an absurdly low price for such a trip. And the comedy comes from the cheapness. To make an advertisement for a New York bus trip, the artist drawing the brochure chose to include a visual of New York's most famous skyline feature, the Twin Towers. They were the most recognizable image of the city. Of course they went on the brochure. Oakley signed off on the design. He confirmed this. times. He also said that he would grant it was eerie, given that it was on the only episode of any television series that had ever built an entire act around jokes set at the World Trade Center. That last part is important. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, the only episode of any American scripted television series that used the World Trade Center Plaza as a major story location and built comedy around it. Plenty of shows set in New York use the towers as background scenery. The Simpsons use them as a plot device. Homer's car was parked there. He spent the episode there. The towers were not decoration. They were the reason the story happened where it happened. Bill Oakley himself noted that this is what made the image eerie. Not just the 9 and the 11 sitting together in a brochure, which has a completely mundane explanation, but the fact that this particular image, carrying this particular coincidental arrangement, came from the one episode that had made the Twin Towers the center of its story. Fact-checking organization Snopes examined the claim that The Simpsons predicted 9/11 and reached a clear conclusion. The claim is false. There is no credible evidence that the creators of the show had any knowledge of the September 11th attacks before they occurred. The image is real. The 9 and the towers are genuinely there in the brochure. The coincidental arrangement is genuinely there, but coincidence is what it is. The dollar amount was chosen for comedic reasons. The towers were chosen because they were the visual symbol of New York. The combination produced an image that, after 2001, looked different than it looked before. Psychologists have a word for this. It is called apophenia. It means the human tendency to find meaningful connections between things that are not actually connected. It is why people see faces in clouds. It is why, after a tragedy, people search backward through everything that came before it, looking for signs they missed. The brain is very good at finding patterns, and it finds patterns even where there are none, especially when it is looking for them after the fact. Nobody watching The City of New York versus Homer Simpson when it first aired in September 1997 saw a 9/11 reference in the brochure. Nobody. The image was there, the 9 and the towers were there, and not a single person who saw the episode during its original broadcast or during its syndication runs over the following 4 years connected those elements into anything meaningful. It took the actual attacks of September 11th, 2001, and then several years of people going back through old media looking for signs to produce the screenshot that then circulated as evidence of prediction. That is the honest story of this image. It was created without any knowledge of what was coming. It was made of completely ordinary choices, a funny price, an obvious visual. It sat in the episode for 4 years without anyone noticing anything unusual about it. Then the world changed, and the image suddenly carried weight it was never designed to carry. What makes this section different from every other section in this essay is that it is the one case where the writers themselves are not willing to call it a prediction, and neither is any responsible fact-checker. Every other case discussed in this essay has at least some element of genuine foresight, however mundane the explanation turns out to be. The Trump prediction came from a writer who was thinking about where American politics could go. The FIFA prediction came from writers who had read the sports journalism on corruption. The Disney Fox sign came from writers who had watched the entertainment industry consolidate and concluded it would keep going. Each of those cases has a version of the story in which someone saw something coming, even if the mechanism was observation rather than magic. The 9/11 image has no such version. There is no explanation in which a writer was thinking about terrorist attacks when they chose a $9 price for a bus trip. There is no version in which the artist drawing the towers in the brochure was making any kind of statement about the future. The image is a coincidence. An eerie one, as even Oakley admitted, a genuinely strange one, as even Gene admitted, but a coincidence. And yet it belongs in this essay for a specific reason. The 9/11 image is the clearest example in The Simpsons prediction catalog of what happens when coincidence intersects with tragedy. The episode was pulled from television because it celebrated a building that had become a wound. The jokes about Tower 1, the plot about Homer's car in the plaza, the whole story built around a place that no longer existed the way it had existed, became impossible to broadcast in the same way. The episode did not predict anything, but it was close enough to the thing that happened that it had to be treated differently afterward. That is a different kind of relationship between a piece of art and a real event. Not prediction, not foresight, something more uncomfortable. The show had looked at the Twin Towers and said, "These are interesting, these are funny, these are the kind of landmark a cartoon family would end up at during a New York episode." And then the towers were gone, and that look, that ordinary creative attention, became something that needed to be managed. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson came back in 2006 with edits. The Tower 1 joke was removed. The episode was allowed to exist again, but not entirely as it was. The image of the $9 brochure was not removed, presumably because most viewers would never slow the episode down enough to notice it, and because removing it would require acknowledging the coincidence more directly than anyone wanted to. The episode is available now. It has been for years. It is still considered one of the better episodes of the later seasons. People watch it as a piece of entertainment history, as a comedy that captured a specific version of New York that no longer quite exists, at a specific cultural moment that is now a long time ago. The brochure is still in it. The 9 and the towers are still there. Al Jean still calls it a completely bizarre, strange thing. Bill Oakley still says the 9 was a comically cheap fare, and the towers were the obvious visual choice, and he will grant that it is eerie. Neither of them has anything more to say about it, because there is nothing more to say. The image is real. The explanation is mundane. The aftermath is strange. That is everything there is to know. It belongs in this essay not because it is a prediction, but because it shows the edge of what the prediction conversation is actually about. When people look at The Simpsons and say the show predicted things, they are doing the same thing that produces the 9/11 reading of the brochure, finding patterns. Some of those patterns are genuinely there, built by writers who were paying attention. Some of them are coincidences dressed up in the weight of what happened afterward. The 9/11 image is the clearest possible example of the second category, which is why it is the most honest case to include. The writers could not have known. They did not know. They made ordinary choices that produced an image that, after the world changed, looked like something it was never meant to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After the strange and the somber, the next section returns to something lighter, which might be the most purely startling case of all. Because while everything discussed so far has involved politics, or disasters, or corporate deals, the next prediction is about a wristwatch, a cartoon wristwatch, drawn in 1995, that turned into one of the most common pieces of technology in the world. Section 9, the smartwatch and video calling. On March 19, 1995, The Simpsons aired an episode called Lisa's Wedding. It was Season 6, Episode 19. It was written by Greg Daniels, directed by Jim Reardon, and it won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program that year, becoming the third episode in the show's history to win in that category. James L. Brooks, one of the show's creators, has said it is one of the best written episodes the show has ever produced. TV Guide ranked it first on its list of the 12 best Simpsons episodes in 1998, calling it the premier example of what makes a Simpsons episode work. It is, by almost any measurement, one of the greatest episodes the show ever made. The story begins at a Renaissance fair. Lisa wanders away from her family and finds a fortune teller's tent. She goes inside. The fortune teller, after proving she knows things about the Simpson family that a stranger should not know, offers to show Lisa the story of her first true love. The episode then jumps forward 15 years into the future, to the year 2010, when Lisa is 23 years old and studying at a university in England. She meets a fellow student named Hugh Parkfield, voiced by actor Mandy Patinkin. Hugh is British, intelligent, and cultured. He and Lisa fall in love. He proposes. The wedding is planned. Then Hugh meets the Simpson family and everything falls apart because Hugh cannot hide his contempt for them and Lisa cannot forgive him for it. She calls off the wedding. The episode returns to the present. The fortune teller tells Lisa the story was about her first love, not her only love. Lisa walks back out into the fair and finds her father, and they share a quiet, genuine moment together. It is an episode about the tension between who you want to be and where you came from, about whether loving someone means accepting everything they are attached to, about Lisa and Homer, and about the specific way those two people are connected despite being so different. It is, in many ways, an episode about love and compromise dressed up as a science fiction story about the future. But people remember it now in large part because of the technology. The year 2010, as imagined in 1995, is full of details about what life would look like 15 years forward. Some of them are wrong in funny ways. Big Ben has been converted into a digital clock that blinks 12 in the way a cheap appliance does after a power outage. Airplanes have been redesigned into shapes that look nothing like real aircraft. There are robots. There are things that do not exist and probably will not exist. And then there are the things that do exist now that in 1995 did not exist at all. When Hugh Parkfield's first attempt at proposing to Lisa goes wrong and he needs to make a call, he raises his wrist and speaks into a device attached to it. The device is small. It wraps around his wrist like a watch. It flips open. He talks into it. It is, in the design language of 1995, a futuristic communication gadget. It is also, in the design language of 2014 onward, a smartwatch. The Apple Watch was announced in September 2014 and became available for purchase in April 2015. The Pebble smartwatch, which was one of the first modern consumer smartwatches to reach a large audience, launched in 2013 through a fundraising campaign. Samsung released its first smart wristband in 2013 as well. By 2014, technology journalists were calling it the year of the smartwatch. The devices had become commercially real, widely available, and increasingly common on people's wrists. The Simpsons had drawn one 19 years earlier. Now, Snopes looked at this claim carefully and issued a partial correction to the way the prediction is often described. Their finding was that The Simpsons should not get full credit for predicting the smartwatch because wrist-mounted communication devices had appeared in fiction long before 1995. Dick Tracy, the comic strip detective created in 1931, famously used a two-way wrist radio starting in 1946. James Bond films going back to the 1970s featured watches that could do extraordinary things. The Jetsons, the animated show from the 1960s, included wrist communication devices. Fred Flintstone used a radio watch. The Inspector Gadget character Penny had a watch that functioned as a computer. Snopes is right about all of this. The Simpsons did not invent the concept of a smartwatch. The idea had been in science fiction for decades before Lisa's wedding aired. But that correction, while factually accurate, misses something about why the Lisa's wedding case is still worth discussing. The other fictional smartwatches, from Dick Tracy to James Bond, were presented as fantasy gadgets, extraordinary technology belonging to extraordinary characters. James Bond's watch could fire a laser or attach to a magnet because James Bond is a spy in an action film where gadgets do impossible things. Dick Tracy's wrist radio was futuristic in a comic strip context, meaning it was always understood as something that did not exist and probably would not. Hugh Parkfield's wrist device in Lisa's wedding is different because of how it is presented. It is not a spy gadget. It is not extraordinary. Hugh is a university student. He uses his wrist communicator the way a person in 1995 would use a mobile phone, to make a quick call when something comes up. The technology is mundane in the world of the episode. It is just how people communicate in the year 2010. It is background technology, ordinary technology, the kind of thing that sits on your wrist and you use without thinking about it because everyone has one. That presentation, the mundane, everyday smartwatch as a normal part of life rather than a fantasy gadget, is closer to what actually happened than anything Dick Tracy or James Bond was describing. When the Apple Watch arrived, it was not marketed as a spy tool or a science fiction novelty. It was marketed as something you wear every day to stay connected, to check messages, to track your health. It was ordinary. That is exactly what Hugh's device was in 1995. Ordinary. Future ordinary, but ordinary. The same episode also showed video calling. After Hugh proposes and Lisa accepts, she immediately calls home to tell her family. She reaches Marge on a screen-based telephone. They can see each other while they talk. The device has a small screen that shows the other person's face in real time. Marge, in her excitement, crosses her fingers and makes a gesture that she seems to forget Lisa can actually see because this is a video call and not a regular phone call. The comedy of the moment comes from Marge not fully grasping the implications of a technology she is using. Video calling, as a mass consumer technology, became widely available in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Apple launched FaceTime in 2010, specifically the year that Lisa's wedding imagined. Skype had been available since 2003 and had become widely used by the mid-2000s. The ability to see the person you were talking to on a screen in real time over a home connection went from a science fiction idea in 1995 to a thing your grandmother does on her phone in the space of about 15 years. The episode predicted the year 2010 as when this technology would be part of normal life, and it was roughly correct. FaceTime launched in 2010. Video calling became genuinely mainstream in the years around that period. The collision of those two predictions in a single episode, the smartwatch and video calling, is what makes Lisa's wedding stand out from the individual cases. Most of the other predictions in this essay are single specific things. A tiger attack, a corporate merger, a political scandal. Lisa's wedding stacked multiple technological predictions into the same 22 minutes, and several of them came true within the time frame the episode was describing. The Shard is another one. In the episode, the London skyline is visible in several scenes. Among the buildings is a pointed glass tower that does not match any real London building as of 1995. It sits to the left of Big Ben in the animated skyline. Its shape, narrow and tapering to a point at the top, is distinctive. The Shard, a real glass tower in London, was completed in 2012 and opened to the public in 2013. It is one of the tallest buildings in Western Europe. It sits in a position relative to the wider London skyline that corresponds closely to where the tower appears in the episode. It was not planned when the episode was made. The design competition that led to its construction happened in the late 1990s. In 1995, there was no version of it on anyone's public drawing board. Collider, covering the episode's 30th anniversary in 2025, noted that Lisa's wedding is the episode that is most commonly credited as the point where The Simpsons transformed from a funny animated show into something that people started describing as genuinely able to see where things were going. The reason the episode works as a prediction vehicle, beyond just the specific things it got right, is is structural. Greg Daniels, who wrote it, was given the task of imagining what the Simpson family's world would look like 15 years forward. Not a dystopia, not a fantasy, just an extrapolation of where things were already heading. The technology in the episode is not random. It follows a logic. Phones are getting smaller and more portable, so in 15 years, they will be on your wrist. Screens are getting better and cheaper, so in 15 years, you will be able to see the person you are calling. Cities are growing and building upward, so in 15 years, London will have a new tower you have not seen yet. Each of those assumptions was reasonable in 1995. Following them 15 years forward and drawing what you find there is not prophecy. It is careful thinking about the direction things were already moving. The Rolling Stones joke is worth including here as well, because it is one of the smaller predictions from the same episode that tends to get overlooked. In the 2010 of Lisa's wedding, there is a poster visible in a scene that reads, "The Rolling Stones Steel Wheelchair Tour 2010. The joke is that the Rolling Stones, who were already considered old by 1995 standards, would still be touring in 2010, at which point they would be so elderly they would need wheelchairs. The Steel Wheelchair Tour is the punchline. The Rolling Stones have not used wheelchairs on their tours, but they were still actively touring in 2010 and have continued touring well past that. Mick Jagger was performing live concerts in his late 70s. Keith Richards has continued to perform. The band that the 1995 joke treated as a symbol of geriatric persistence turned out to be, in reality, one of the longest-running live acts in rock history. The joke was that they would never stop. They have not stopped. The writer Greg Daniels was asked about the episode in later years and described the process of writing it as surprisingly fun. He had expected it to be difficult to imagine the future while keeping the show's characters recognizable and its emotional core intact. He found that following the logic of where existing things were heading made the technology aspects easier than he had expected. You do not need to invent the future wholesale. You need to watch what is already moving and draw where it is going. That method, watching what is already moving and drawing where it is going, is the best description of what The Simpsons has always done when it gets predictions right. It is not a crystal ball. It is close attention. The smartwatch in Lisa's wedding is not proof of supernatural foresight. It is proof that someone in 1995 looked at how communication technology was changing and concluded that the logical endpoint of the direction it was going was a device on your wrist. They drew that device. 19 years later, everyone was wearing one. James L. Brooks called Lisa's wedding one of the best written episodes in the show's history. He said that long before the smartwatch comparisons, long before the Shard was built, long before FaceTime launched in the year the episode was set in. He said it because the episode is genuinely beautiful, because it is about Lisa and Homer, because it handles love and disappointment and family with more care than most dramas manage in an hour, let alone a cartoon in 22 minutes. The predictions are real, and they are interesting, but they live inside an episode that would matter even if none of them had come true, because what the episode is actually about has nothing to do with technology. It is about a daughter who has to choose between the future she wants and the family she comes from. It is about a father who loves his daughter so much that the most important scene in the episode is the two of them walking quietly through a fair together, not saying very much, just being near each other. The smartwatch is there. The video call is there. The Shard is there. And underneath all of it, the thing that made the episode worth making is Homer and Lisa, and a story about love that has nothing to do with what year it is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That brings us to the last section of this essay, and the one that should, by rights, be the least dramatic. No pandemics, no political upheavals, no government surveillance or corporate mergers or tiger attacks. Just a sport almost nobody in America had ever watched, a gold medal nobody expected, and a cartoon family that got there 8 years before the real team did. Section 10. The U.S. Men's Curling Gold Medal. On February 14, 2010, The Simpsons aired an episode called Boy Meets Curl. It was Season 21, Episode 12. It aired on Valentine's Day, which the episode acknowledges in its story. Homer and Marge, walking through Springfield on a date, accidentally wander into a curling rink. They pick up the equipment by mistake, slide stones across the ice, and discover that they are naturally good at it. So good, in fact, that they end up representing the United States at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, Canada, which in real life were also happening in February 2010, at the exact same time the episode was airing. The episode follows Homer and Marge as they compete in couples curling at the Olympics. Alongside this, Bart and Lisa visit the Olympic gift shop and get into a separate storyline about collector's pins, which were a real and popular part of Olympic culture at the Vancouver Games. The two storylines run in parallel. By the end of the episode, Homer and Marge win the gold medal for the United States in curling, defeating Sweden in the final. That is the prediction. The United States wins Olympic gold in curling. They beat Sweden. The episode aired in 2010, the same year as the Vancouver Winter Olympics. In reality, at the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics, the United States men's curling team did not win gold. They did not win silver. They did not win bronze. They did not medal at all. The episode aired during the actual Olympic Games and got the outcome completely wrong for that specific year. 8 years later, everything changed. At the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, the United States men's curling team won the gold medal. It was the first Olympic curling gold medal in American history. The sport had been part of the Winter Olympics since 1998, and the United States had never won it. They won it in 2018, and in the final, the team they defeated was Sweden. The Simpsons had shown this exact outcome 8 years earlier. America wins curling gold. Sweden loses in the final. Wikipedia's entry on The Simpsons predictions lists the curling gold medal as one of its most clearly documented cases. The facts are verifiable, specific, and not subject to interpretation. The episode showed a thing. That thing happened to the correct country against the correct opponent 8 years later. There is no ambiguity in the comparison and no need to stretch anything to make it fit. What makes this prediction interesting as a case study, especially coming at the end of this essay after 9 sections that involved pandemics and politics and corporate mergers, is how simple it is. It is not about surveillance states or financial crises or the direction of technology. It is about a sport. A sport that, in America in 2010, almost nobody cared about or followed closely. The writers chose curling for this episode not because they had studied the competitive landscape of international winter sports and made a calculated guess about which country would eventually win. They chose curling because it is funny. Curling is a sport where people slide heavy stones across ice while their teammates frantically sweep the ice in front of the stone with brooms. It looks, to an unfamiliar audience, absolutely ridiculous. The sweeping especially. The intensity with which competitive curlers sweep the ice, shouting at each other, reading the ice, adjusting their technique, is something that takes years to appreciate and looks, on first viewing, like people frantically cleaning a floor in front of a slowly moving rock. The Simpsons chose it precisely because Homer Simpson, sweeping ice with a broom while Marge slides a stone, is an inherently funny image. The choice of having the United States win the gold medal was driven by the same logic that drives most sports episodes of The Simpsons. The story needs an ending, and the ending that feels best for a story about two ordinary people who accidentally discovered they were good at something is that they win. Homer and Marge do not go to the Olympics and finish respectably in the middle of the field. They go and they win, because that is the story the episode is telling. The gold medal ending is not a prediction, it is a narrative choice. But but narrative choices can still be right. And this one was 8 years late, but right. The 2018 United States men's curling team was not a collection of professional athletes in the traditional sense. Curling in America exists at the edges of mainstream sport. The players on that team had day jobs. They trained in rinks that were not built for elite athletic programs. They had been working at the sport for years, largely outside of public attention, because curling was not the kind of thing that American sports audiences followed. When they won gold in Pyeongchang, it was treated as a genuine shock. The coverage was warm and a little disbelieving, the tone of sports journalism that greets an outcome nobody quite expected. The team was skipped, which is the curling term for the player who calls the strategy and delivers key shots, by a man named John Schuster. Schuster had been part of the United States curling program for years. He had competed at previous Olympics without winning. He was 35 years old when the team won gold in 2018. The other members of the team were Tyler George, Matt Hamilton, John Landsteiner, and Joe Polo. They beat Sweden in the final by a score of 10-7. None of this appears in the Simpsons episode, of course. The episode is about Homer and Marge, not about a real team, but the outcome, the country, and the opponent in the final are all correct. The curling episode is also notable for something that has nothing to do with the gold medal prediction. The episode aired on February 14th, 2010, while the Vancouver Winter Olympics were actually happening. The writers made an episode about the Olympics, set during the Olympics, and aired it during the Olympics. This means the show was not guessing about a future event in the way that most of the predictions in this essay work. They were commenting on a current event in real time. The gold medal ending was not a guess about what would happen at those specific games. It was a narrative conclusion to a story that was running parallel to the real event. That is actually the most honest version of how to understand this prediction. The writers were not trying to guess whether America would win curling gold in 2010. They were making a Valentine's Day episode about Homer and Marge discovering a shared skill and winning together, and they set it at the Olympics because the Olympics were happening that week. The gold medal was the right ending for that story. It was the wrong outcome for the real 2010 games. And then, 8 years later, it became the right outcome for real against the right opponent. There is something quietly perfect about ending this essay with this case. Every other prediction discussed in the preceding 9 sections involves the writers of The Simpsons observing something real about the world, following a trend or reading a news story or watching an industry or sensing a political direction, and then building a piece of comedy around what they found. The observations behind those predictions are, in most cases, genuinely impressive. The writers were paying close attention. They were smart about what they were looking at. Their educated guesses were often educated by serious engagement with the world outside Springfield. The curling prediction has none of that. It is a Valentine's Day episode about Homer and Marge. It is set at the Olympics because the Olympics were on television. It ends with a gold medal because stories about underdogs discovering hidden talents end with gold medals. The opponent is Sweden because Sweden is a curling powerhouse and a plausible final opponent. None of these choices required research or insight or careful reading of the world. They required a writing staff that knew how to structure a story, and yet the outcome they chose, the country that wins, the opponent in the final, both turned out to be correct 8 years later. This is the thing about The Simpsons and prediction that the curling episode makes clearest. When you produce over 800 episodes of a show, when you tell thousands of stories across 35 years, when you set those stories in the real world using real locations and real events and real cultural moments, some of what you invent is going to happen. Not because you saw it coming, because the supply of stories you tell is large enough that the world, given enough time, will eventually catch up to some of them. The writers of The Simpsons are smart. Many of them have advanced degrees. Several of them studied mathematics or science before moving into comedy writing. Al Jean studied mathematics at Harvard. The writing staff has always been described as one of the most educated in television history. These are people who read widely, think carefully, and bring a level of analytical attention to their work that most television shows do not have. When they make educated guesses, the education behind those guesses is real. But educated guesses are still guesses, and the curling prediction, sitting at the end of this list of 10 cases, is the clearest reminder of that fact. Nobody in that writer's room in 2009, when the episode was being produced, was analyzing the long-term competitive trajectory of American curling and concluding that within 8 years, the country would win its first Olympic gold. They were writing a Valentine's Day episode about Homer and Marge. They needed a sport that was funny. They needed an ending that felt good. They wrote what the story required. 8 years later, John Schuster and his teammates swept the ice in Pyeongchang and beat Sweden and won America its first curling gold medal. And someone, somewhere, pulled out the Simpsons episode from 2010 and put the two things next to each other. The reaction was the same reaction that has greeted every case in this essay, the same feeling of something slightly uncanny, of a cartoon world and the real world briefly occupying the same coordinates. That feeling is real. The Simpsons has earned it, partly through genuine observational intelligence and partly through sheer volume. 800 episodes is a lot of darts. Some of them were always going to hit the board. What the 10 cases in this essay actually show, taken together, is not a show with supernatural abilities. They show a show that has been paying close attention to the world for a very long time, that employs exceptionally smart writers who make jokes rooted in genuine observation, and that has been on the air long enough for the world to catch up to enough of those observations to build a mythology around them. The mythology is real in the sense that the comparisons are real. The Osaka flu and COVID-19 share structural similarities that are genuinely striking. The Trump prediction came from a writer who called it a warning to America 16 years before the warning proved accurate. The NSA scene in the movie was 6 years ahead of the Snowden revelations. The Siegfried and Roy prediction was the writers following dangerous logic to its conclusion a decade before it arrived. The Disney-Fox sign was a corporate observation that took 21 years to become true. The FIFA corruption episode aired 14 months before the real arrests. The Greek financial crisis was described in 5 words 3 years before it peaked. The 9/11 image is something even the people who made it cannot fully explain. The smartwatch and video calling arrived in the exact window the episode described, and the curling gold came true 8 years late against the exact opponent the show imagined. None of it is magic. All of it is real. And the gap between those two things is exactly where The Simpsons has always lived, in the space between the world as it is and the world as it might be, telling jokes about both, and occasionally, almost accidentally, telling the truth about what comes next. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.